authority to reclassify this pistol as a short-barreled rifle simply because it has a buffer tube?
We're pro-Second Amendment, but at the same time, we want to take your Second Amendment rights away from you.
Connecticut delegation, which is incredible. I think on this issue and many others, you're the best delegation in the United States.
Breaking news. The Supreme Court shocks the nation with a landmark decision. Concealed carry guns are now officially eliminated. Get ready for a heated debate that will redefine personal protection. The heated question. A significant Second Amendment case titled United States versus Rahimi has recently been submitted to the Supreme Court for conference. This case revolves around the federal prohibition on gun possession for individuals subject to domestic violence restraining orders. The Fifth Circuit, in a recent ruling, declared this prohibition unconstitutional under the Second Amendment.
Blatantly denying the power grab being carried out by the executive branch yet again.
The uptick in violence has just been astronomical. The gun violence.
As a kid, I came out of a different movement, the civil rights movement.
Who showed up here said one thing that felt good about doing this kind of event was that they felt empowered.
The court's decision was heavily influenced by the Supreme Court's landmark ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. It's important to note that the facts surrounding this case are troubling, and the defendant, Mr. Rahimi, has engaged in various unlawful activities. The government, however, focused on the federal prohibition based on the domestic violence restraining order, which has led to the current legal proceedings. Between December 2020 and January 2021, Mr. Rahimi was involved in 5 shootings in and around Arlington, Texas. These incidents included firing shots into a residence, engaging in a car accident, and firing shots at individuals and vehicles. The Arlington Police Department identified Mr. Rahimi as the suspect in these shootings and obtained a search warrant for his home. During the search, law enforcement officers discovered a rifle and a pistol, which Mr. Rahimi admitted to possessing. He also acknowledged being subject to a civil protection order issued by a Texas court, which prohibited him from harassing, stalking, or threatening his ex-girlfriend and their child. The protective order explicitly forbade Mr. Rahimi from possessing any firearms.
Pretty clear about the extent to which this is an abuse of the Administrative Procedures Act.
Is it a difficult question to understand?
Well, I'm sure it's enormously high.
It's 36 per 100,000 people.
With it off safe, just that little bit of motion, you can hear the click.
As a result, a federal grand jury indicted Mr. Rahimi for violating 18 U.S.C. Section 922G8, which pertains to possessing a firearm while under a domestic violence restraining order. Early in the case, Mr. Rahimi challenged the constitutionality of this federal law but was unsuccessful. The Fifth Circuit, relying on previous precedent and employing an interest-balancing approach, upheld the law as constitutional.
Because he doesn't care about separation of powers either.
The Texas House of Representatives just voted to impeach Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton.
How many guns has the ATF lost?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
The extent to which this is an unconstitutional violation of our Second Amendment rights. But what is also true is that it is incumbent upon the United States Congress, the House of Representatives in particular.
Twime says the Missouri law exposes people to greater harm by interfering with the federal government's ability to enforce firearms regulations.
However, the landscape shifted when the Supreme Court issued its ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. This decision emphasized textual analysis, historical considerations, and adherence to tradition as the appropriate framework for evaluating Second Amendment cases, rejecting the interest-balancing approach. Subsequently, the Fifth Circuit panel in Mr. Rahimi's case reconsidered its prior opinion and concluded that, under Bruin, the federal law prohibiting firearm possession by individuals with domestic violence restraining orders violated the Second Amendment. Unsurprisingly, the government and its representatives were dissatisfied with this ruling and were unwilling to accept the loss. Hence, they sought Supreme Court review, hoping to challenge the Fifth Circuit's decision and defend the constitutionality of the federal prohibition. The Supreme Court's decision to conference on this case indicates its recognition of the significance and potential implications surrounding the constitutional rights of individuals with domestic violence restraining orders.
And having to tell her that other 9-year-olds were just killed in a shooting is horrific.
Real background checks could stop a lot of illegal guns going in different places in the country.
This shall not be infringed, and the word infringe means by banning parts on firearms.
The outcome of this review will undoubtedly have an impact on gun rights and the extent to which restrictions can be imposed based on such restraining orders. As the case progresses, legal experts and advocates will closely monitor the court's analysis and the potential reevaluation of Second Amendment jurisprudence in relation to domestic violence situations.
It takes extraordinary courage for them to stand up here and retell the story.
Anti-gunners put in there to keep the guns out of the hands of lawful citizens in New York State.
Affect us here, and it was such a breath of fresh air for the Second Amendment people.
The government has filed a writ of certiorari petition with the Supreme Court seeking a review of the issue at hand. The case in question involves the constitutionality of 18 U.S.C. Section 922G8, which prohibits the possession of firearms by individuals subject to domestic violence restraining orders. The government argues that this provision, as applied to the defendant, violates the Second Amendment and seeks a broader examination of its constitutionality on its face.
June of 2021, you changed the department's asylum rules so that it could apply to individuals with significant gang violence.
Most apparent here, a defense of the Second Amendment, which this most certainly is.
Shooting what is called plunging fire, which is down on an area.
Constitutional challenge. In their petition, the government points to the recent decision by the Fifth Circuit, which concluded that Section 922G8 violates the Second Amendment, not just as applied to the specific defendant in the case, but on its face. This means that the Fifth Circuit deemed the entire provision to be unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. However, the government strongly disagrees with this conclusion and asserts that the Fifth Circuit's decision was profoundly mistaken. The government's argument centers on the fact that disarming individuals who pose a threat to the safety of others has long been a part of established legal tradition. They contend that Section 922G8 falls comfortably within this tradition and serves as a necessary measure to protect potential victims of domestic violence. According to the government, the provision only comes into operation after a court, following due process, determines that the person subject to the restraining order presents a credible threat to the physical safety of their intimate partner or child.
We can expect in the future that more people will be carrying handguns on the streets in places like Los Angeles, Boston, and New York City.
As many of you out there, either parents, relatives, and/or victims yourself,
to do anything about what the president is doing to exercise that authority unconstitutionally, as was the case with student loans.
Because people buy hundreds of guns legally and then they sell them illegally.
Furthermore, the government emphasizes that the Fifth Circuit's decision contradicts Supreme Court precedent and conflicts with decisions made by other courts of appeals. They argue that the historical analysis outlined in the Supreme Court's ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin was misapplied by the Fifth Circuit. The government asserts that the interest-balancing approach used by the Fifth Circuit should be replaced by the historical analysis that considers the text, history, and tradition of the Second Amendment as clarified in the Bruin decision. In their petition, the government requests the Supreme Court to grant certiorari and reverse the Fifth Circuit's decision. They argue that this case presents an opportunity for the court to clarify the application of the Bruin ruling and to correct the Fifth Circuit's misinterpretation of it. Additionally, the government suggests that a review by the Supreme Court would have significant implications for domestic violence victims, as the Fifth Circuit's decision could undermine crucial measures aimed at protecting them. The significance of this case is further underscored by the interest expressed by other individuals and entities. For example, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, has indicated a desire to participate in this case. This highlights the broader impact and potential consequences that the Supreme Court's decision could have on gun regulation and domestic violence prevention efforts across the country.
Inventing the pistol stabilizing brace to help his friend, a disabled combat veteran, at the shooting range.
You gave testimony that the brave ATF agents are the ones showing up at 2 a.m. after a burglary.
Do any of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle give a whit about separation of powers?
Connecticut delegation, which is incredible. I think on this issue and many others, you're the best delegation in the United States.
No guns were lost. They were stolen by an individual who's now in prison.
And of course, we've got a lot of criticism over this. So why is it not a machine gun?
In areas that are poor, mostly minority, there's a mass shooting.
Congress wants to change the law and come up with a new interpretation, then ATF will follow that new interpretation.
As the Supreme Court considers whether to grant certiorari and take up this case, the outcome will not only affect the specific defendant involved, but also have implications for the constitutionality of firearm restrictions related to domestic violence restraining orders. The court's ruling will shape the legal landscape surrounding the intersection of Second Amendment rights and measures aimed at protecting victims of domestic violence.
She proves you can run for office ending gun violence in the South and you can win.
AK-47 is an automatic Kalashnikov model of 1947.
You can prevent the next tragedy. You can save life. You can save families in the process.
Thought it just like, wow, it doesn't fit the definition, it doesn't fit the rulings, but we better run this up the chain.
Some months later, during an ATF audit, I was told the background check was now a non-approval.
Because they like the outcome of the policy, the banning of a piece of plastic.
Supreme Court review. In a significant development, the state of California has filed an amicus brief urging the Supreme Court to take up the case regarding the constitutionality of domestic violence restraining orders and the Second Amendment. California argues that the Supreme Court should grant review in order to clarify the application of the landmark decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. This case has garnered attention from various perspectives, as both pro-Second Amendment and anti-gun advocates are calling for the Supreme Court's intervention. California emphasizes that while the Second Amendment protects the rights of law-abiding citizens to possess firearms for self-defense, it does not prohibit states from enacting essential gun regulations, including restrictions on gun possession for individuals deemed dangerous.
That requirement for showing a heightened need for self-defense, that was the teeth of these permitting laws.
And within less than 15 minutes, you can walk out the front door here with a rifle or a shotgun.
American citizens in places like New Orleans and Baltimore and St. Louis begin to seek asylum in countries like Honduras and Guatemala.
I don't know if you're referring to any particular incident.
The state echoes the argument made by the federal government, asserting that the Fifth Circuit failed to conduct a proper analysis in light of the Bruin decision. Currently, the case has been distributed for Supreme Court conference, scheduled for June 22nd. During this conference, the Supreme Court justices will convene to determine whether they will grant review or deny it. It is worth noting that a minimum of 4 justices is required to grant review. However, it's also important to consider that out of the thousands of cases submitted to the Supreme Court each year, only a fraction are accepted for review, typically around 100 to 150 cases. The outcome of this case holds significant implications for the interpretation and application of Bruin, as well as for the definition of prohibited individuals under the Second Amendment. It's an issue that is currently being litigated at multiple levels, making it a topic of considerable interest and debate. Even if the Supreme Court were to deny review, the case's impact would still reverberate as precedent, potentially inspiring further challenges in other circuit courts.
To run enhanced background checks on young people under 21 trying to buy a firearm.
This government can protect its own people, except for 36 out of every 100,000 for murders.
Types of disputes that would be settled by people yelling at each other, maybe engaging in a fist fight, are being settled with guns.
As the legal proceedings unfold, it is essential to closely monitor this case. The ramifications extend beyond the specific circumstances of domestic violence restraining orders, touching on broader questions about the scope of the Second Amendment and the balance between gun rights and public safety. The Supreme Court's decision, whether it grants review or not, will shape the future landscape of gun regulations and Second Amendment jurisprudence.
I'm just inspired by the next generation. I think it's a time for a big change.
Since you rewrote the rules of asylum based on the perceived degree of violence in these countries.
Selling more guns in the last 3 weeks than we did in the last 8 months.
But for me, and for most of you, here's what it really is. It's an important first step.
When somebody bump fires, think of this as a bump-fire stock and able to move.
To be clear, this wasn't based on violence. This is based on threats specifically to individuals, on gangs.
Supreme Court's landmark ruling. In a groundbreaking ruling, the U.S. Supreme Court, with its conservative supermajority, made a historic declaration affirming a constitutional right to carry a handgun in public for self-defense. The court's 6-3 vote struck down a long-standing New York gun law that restricted its licenses to carry guns outside the home to individuals engaged in specific activities, like hunting or carrying cash as messengers. The court's decision represents the most far-reaching interpretation of gun rights to date, and it is poised to have a significant impact on gun regulation throughout the country. This ruling challenges and undermines rules that previously limited the presence of firearms in public places.
I don't really see the purpose of letting other people that don't really know what harm they can do.
You specifically said that.
But I said...
That's the law. What does mandatory mean?
I'm trying to say that...
Does it mean that prosecutors get a choice?
I would expect to see in the coming months and years is a lot of focus on whether or not enough places are deemed sensitive right now.
The Attorney General himself, Ken Paxton, tweeted saying, quote, "What we just witnessed is illegal."
Justice Clarence Thomas, writing for the majority, emphasized that the right to bear arms in public for self-defense is not a second-class right subject to different rules. He drew a parallel to the First Amendment, highlighting that just as unpopular speech is protected, the Second Amendment is not restricted solely to those who can demonstrate a special need to carry firearms in public. In response to the ruling, Governor Kathy Hochul of New York, where a recent mass shooting occurred, expressed strong disapproval, deeming the decision reckless and reprehensible. She criticized the prevailing gun culture and emphasized the moral obligation of states and governors to address the issue. The majority opinion of the Supreme Court suggests a reluctance to tolerate many gun regulations previously upheld in the interest of public safety. Going forward, the courts will primarily consider the time when the Bill of Rights was enacted as a guide for assessing the permissibility of regulations. Legal experts predict that this decision will embolden organizations like the National Rifle Association to challenge numerous gun laws, extending beyond New York and beyond the scope of handguns. It is anticipated that proponents of gun rights will argue that prior court decisions were flawed and will seek to redefine the boundaries of permissible gun regulations.
We are not finished. We are not finished. We are not finished.
Not one more! Not one more! Not one more!
The most serious readily provable offenses in cases where mandatory minimums are present because it's not warranted.
Sensitive places doctrine was not at issue in this case and still exists.
He went on to say he looks forward to a quick resolution in the Texas Senate.
I pull the gun into my trigger finger.
Who are prepared and carry a gun oftentimes have to make split-second decisions.
The ruling also raises concerns about the future of existing gun laws. Provisions in the Senate gun bill, including red flag laws, limitations on high-capacity mags, and restrictions on firearms for individuals with a history of domestic violence, could potentially face legal challenges based on the court's broad interpretation of the Second Amendment. Overall, the Supreme Court's decision to recognize a constitutional right to carry handguns in public for self-defense sets a new precedent in the ongoing debate on gun control. It signals a shift towards heightened individual gun rights and places increased scrutiny on regulations that restrict the carrying of firearms outside the home. The ramifications of this ruling extend beyond New York, and its impact on future gun legislation and legal challenges is yet to be fully realized.
Conventional wisdom was we would never get any Republicans to support gun legislation, period.
Are ones where, in fact, it's most likely that they should be bringing the highest and mandatory minimum.
Details of the law, but folks, listen at home. Here's a quick summary of what this law is doing. It's already allowing.
Are demonstrating that blind loyalty to Speaker Dade Phelan is more important than upholding their oath of office.
Might end up being a message amendment because the President of the United States will almost assuredly veto it.
Supreme Court redefines gun rights. The recent landmark ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court with its conservative supermajority has ignited debates and raised questions about the limits and implications of the decision. In a significant departure from previous rulings, the court declared by a 6-3 vote that there is a constitutional right to carry a handgun in public for self-defense. This ruling struck down a century-old gun law in New York that restricted licenses for carrying guns outside the home to individuals engaged in activities like hunting or carrying cash as messengers. Writing for the majority, Justice Clarence Thomas emphasized that the right to bear arms in public for self-defense is not a second-class right subject to different rules. He drew parallels to the First Amendment, highlighting that just as unpopular speech is still protected.
What about Colombia?
I don't know.
23 per 100,000.
Ludicrous. That doesn't happen. We are the lawful, legal citizens of the state.
Holding it a certain way, it'll continue to bump.
Which many have described as the most significant gun safety law in 30 years, and it is.
The Second Amendment is not limited to those who can demonstrate a special need to carry a firearm in public. The implications of the Supreme Court's decision are far-reaching, as it has the potential to reshape gun regulation across the country. By asserting the constitutional right to carry handguns in public, the court has called into question the validity of rules that impose limitations on guns in public spaces. However, a concurring opinion by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, joined by Chief Justice John Roberts, sought to clarify the limits of the court's opinion. They emphasized that the decision does not prevent states from imposing licensing requirements for carrying handguns. Kavanaugh pointed out that 43 states already have what are known as shall-issue licensing regimes, where applicants undergo fingerprinting, background checks, mental health records checks, and firearms training. However, it is important to note that the requirements can vary among different shall-issue states. Opinions among legal scholars are divided regarding the impact of this ruling. Some, like the University of Tennessee law professor Glenn Reynolds,
distribution of 10 to 40 million of these braces, and the implementation of your rule. Did Congress pass a law?
New law regarding pistol braces. It's actually a ruling because the ATF does not have the authority.
Have the authority to reclassify this pistol as a short-barreled rifle simply because it has a buffer tube?
It's illegal to own unless you have a permit or a tax stamp. This is legal. It's considered a piece of plastic. All right. Together, they're illegal.
Believes that the decision will not lead to significant changes. Reynolds points out that the claims of increased lawlessness, as expressed by certain officials, may be exaggerated given the existing challenges faced by certain cities. In addition to striking down the New York law, the Supreme Court ruling invalidates similar laws in other states, including New Jersey, California, Maryland, Massachusetts, Hawaii, and the District of Columbia. Justice Kavanaugh highlighted that these jurisdictions may still impose restrictions on licenses, but they must be based on objective criteria resembling those in shall-issue states.
The submitted firearm brace, when attached to a firearm, does not convert that weapon to be fired from the shoulder and would not alter the classification, distribution of 10 to 40 million of these braces, and the implementation of your rule. Did Congress pass a law?
What changes that item that was submitted was not produced and was not the item that was marketed.
To be able to assist those that might not have full use of all of their limbs or whatever else.
So you say that the brace changed, and so you had to implement this rule.
The ruling leaves certain issues unresolved, particularly the question of where handguns can be entirely banned. Places such as sports stadiums, subways, areas near schools, major events like Times Square on New Year's Eve, rock concerts, and establishments serving alcohol pose challenges in determining the scope of the Second Amendment. The court has called for analogical reasoning, drawing parallels to historical bans on guns in sensitive places to determine the constitutionality of modern-day restrictions. President Biden expressed his deep disappointment with the ruling, stating that it contradicts both common sense and the Constitution. He pledged to continue seeking executive actions to address gun violence and urged states to pass and enforce laws aimed at protecting against gun violence.
That are not
Is this brace exempt from your rule?
I can't sit here and classify.
This is the brace you wrote the letter. Brace that this letter was responsive to. Are you telling me that this brace is exempt from your rule?
It's not ruled to be attached as a short-barreled rifle. It will not be subject to the rule.
The Supreme Court's decision has significant implications for future gun regulations, triggering discussions on the interpretation of the Second Amendment and the delicate balance between individual rights and public safety. It's expected to lead to renewed challenges to a wide range of gun laws across the country, as proponents of gun rights view this ruling as an opportunity to challenge existing regulations. As the debates unfold, the impact of this ruling will shape the landscape of gun laws and continue to be a subject of scrutiny and analysis.
Or how many ever tax stamps you might have on your gun, because if I'm running a silencer, they might need that too.
Would you please quit telling this committee that the brace has changed and that's why you did the...
Because you have to already look at the price of everything that you want to build out, and then an additional $200 tax you have to pay.
You're not exempting the same brace that you gave this letter to.
If the brace is submitted, we'll classify it.
Corlett case. New York State Rifle and Pistol Association Incorporated versus Corlett is a significant Supreme Court case that revolves around the right to carry handguns in public for self-defense. The case emerged as a challenge to a long-standing gun law in New York that placed restrictions on individuals' ability to obtain licenses to carry guns outside their homes. The case represents a crucial moment in the ongoing debate over Second Amendment rights and gun regulations in the United States. At the heart of the case was New York's law, which limited the issuances of licenses to carry guns in public to individuals who could demonstrate a special need. This included individuals engaged in sports like hunting or shooting, and those employed as messengers carrying cash. The plaintiffs, represented by the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, argued that this law violated their Second Amendment rights by unduly restricting their ability to carry firearms for self-defense. The Supreme Court's conservative supermajority, in a 6-3 decision, struck down the New York law and recognized a constitutional right to carry handguns in public for self-defense. The majority opinion, written by Justice Clarence Thomas, asserted that the right to bear arms in public is not a second-class right subject to different rules than those governing the right to keep arms at home. The decision is considered significant because it extends the reach of the Second Amendment beyond the confines of the home and has implications for gun regulation nationwide.
New law regarding pistol braces. It's actually a ruling because the ATF does not have the authority. It's illegal to own unless you have a permit or a tax stamp.
Justice Thomas's opinion emphasized the importance of treating the right to bear arms with the same level of constitutional protection as other fundamental rights. He drew parallels with the First Amendment, highlighting that just as the government cannot ban unpopular speech, it cannot restrict the carrying of firearms in public to only those individuals who can demonstrate a special need. The decision underscores the principle that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to self-defense beyond the boundaries of their residence. However, it is important to note that the majority opinion does not invalidate all gun regulations. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, joined by Chief Justice John Roberts, wrote a concurring opinion to clarify the limits of the court's decision. They highlighted that states can still impose certain licensing requirements for carrying handguns in public. Many states already have shall-issue licensing regimes in place, which may include background checks, fingerprinting, mental health records checks, and firearms training. The concurring opinion acknowledged that states retain the authority to regulate the manner in which individuals exercise their right to carry firearms.
To actually make laws without congressional approval. They're really there to enforce laws.
ATF agreed to, in 2012, should not be under the jurisdiction of your rule?
You can apply for the tax stamp and not pay the $200 fee. It's a one-time fee.
The ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association Incorporated versus Corlett has significant implications for gun regulations nationwide. It challenges the restrictions imposed by New York and other states that limit the ability to carry handguns outside the home based on a special need. The decision will likely prompt legal challenges to similar laws in other states, potentially leading to the relaxation of restrictions on carrying firearms in public. The case has ignited passionate debates surrounding Second Amendment rights and public safety. Supporters of the decision argue that it upholds individual liberties and affirms the right to self-defense, while opponents express concerns about the potential impact on public safety and the increased presence of firearms in public places. The ruling also raises questions about the balance between individual rights and the government's duty to protect public safety. Impact on personal protection. The New York State Rifle and Pistol Association Incorporated versus Corlett case has significant implications for both personal protection and public safety regarding the expansion of gun rights. The case centers around the issue of whether individuals have the right to carry concealed firearms outside their homes for self-defense purposes. The impact on personal protection is substantial. The Supreme Court's decision in favor of expanding gun rights acknowledges the fundamental right to self-defense and recognizes the importance of individuals being able to protect themselves and their loved ones. By allowing law-abiding citizens to carry concealed firearms, it provides them with an additional means of defense in potentially dangerous situations. This decision empowers individuals to take responsibility for their own safety and exercise their Second Amendment rights. Supporters argue that expanding gun rights for personal protection enhances individual autonomy and provides a deterrent against crime. They contend that an armed citizenry can act as a check on potential threats and may discourage criminals from targeting innocent people. They believe that when responsible individuals have the ability to carry concealed firearms, it can create a safer environment by reducing response times in emergencies and preventing crimes from occurring in the first place. However, opponents express concerns about the potential negative impact on public safety.
The ATF could look at this and say, you know what, that brace is no longer, considered legal.
They argue that the proliferation of concealed carry firearms may lead to an increase in gun-related incidents, accidents, and violence. They worry that allowing more people to carry concealed weapons without stringent regulations or adequate training could result in unintended consequences. They fear that mistaken judgments or conflicts escalating quickly could lead to tragic outcomes. Critics of expanded gun rights also raise concerns about the potential for firearms falling into the wrong hands. They argue that the decision could make it easier for individuals with malicious intent or those who are prohibited from owning firearms to carry concealed weapons. This may pose a significant risk to public safety, particularly in places with high population density or sensitive locations such as schools, government buildings, or public gatherings. To address these concerns, some proponents of expanded gun rights argue for responsible regulations and licensing requirements. They believe that implementing thorough background checks, training programs, and ongoing evaluations can help ensure that individuals carrying concealed firearms are qualified and responsible. They argue that these measures can strike a balance between personal protection and public safety, ensuring that those who exercise their rights do so responsibly. The impact of this case on personal protection and public safety will vary across different states and jurisdictions. While the Supreme Court's ruling establishes a precedent at the federal level, individual states will still maintain the authority to regulate concealed carry laws and set their own requirements. Some states may choose to adopt stricter regulations to address public safety concerns, while others may embrace more permissive policies to align with the expanded interpretation of the Second Amendment. Ultimately, the implications of the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association Incorporated versus Corlett case extend beyond personal protection and public safety. It touches on deeply held values of individual rights, constitutional interpretation, and the delicate balance between personal freedom and societal well-being. As with any significant legal decision, ongoing debates and discussions will shape the implementation and impact of expanded gun rights in the years to come. Reevaluating concealed carry laws. The court struck down New York's law that required individuals to demonstrate a proper cause or special need to obtain a concealed carry permit. This requirement, which restricted the ability to carry a concealed handgun outside the home, was deemed inconsistent with Second Amendment protections. This ruling represents the most extensive expansion of gun rights since the landmark 2008 decision in District of Columbia versus Heller. The court reaffirmed that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm outside of militia service for lawful purposes such as self-defense. While the court recognized that the Second Amendment is not unlimited, it left the door open for what can constitutionally be permissible restrictions. Legal experts argue that this ruling fundamentally changes the landscape of Second Amendment doctrine. It imposes significant constraints on the government's ability to regulate firearms, making it more challenging to enact gun control measures. The decision upends previous interpretations and introduces new considerations which may lead to challenges against existing gun regulations nationwide. The Supreme Court's decision in this case was divided along ideological lines, with the conservative majority voting to strike down New York's law. Justice Clarence Thomas authored the majority opinion, joined by Chief Justice John Roberts and Justices Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. On the other hand, Justice Stephen Breyer, joined by Justices Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, dissented. While the ruling directly impacts New York's law, it has implications for other states with similar restrictions. Justice Thomas explicitly mentioned proper cause standards and laws in California, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. Consequently, challenges to concealed carry laws in these states may arise, potentially reshaping the legal framework for gun regulation beyond New York. The decision also raises concerns about the potential consequences for the bipartisan gun safety deal currently being considered in the Senate. Legal experts question the constitutionality of provisions within the deal, such as red flag laws and closing the boyfriend loophole. The court's emphasis on the historical tradition and compatibility with the Second Amendment's unqualified command may challenge the validity of these measures, which introduce modern innovations in firearm regulation. The ruling's impact on personal protection and public safety is complex. On one hand, it expands access to concealed carry, potentially allowing individuals to better protect themselves in public spaces. However, this broader distribution of firearms raises concerns about the potential risks associated with increased gun availability. It underscores the need for careful regulation and balancing the protection of individual rights with measures to ensure public safety. As the ruling reverberates across the legal landscape, its full consequences will become more apparent. Future legal challenges and legislative debates on gun rights and regulations will be influenced by the court's interpretation of the Second Amendment and the boundaries it establishes for concealed carry. The balance between personal protection and public safety will continue to be a central concern as society grapples with the implications of this ruling. Future of firearms regulation. The case regarding the constitutionality of domestic violence restraining orders and the Second Amendment raises critical questions about the future of firearms regulation and constitutional interpretation in the United States. The outcome of this case could have far-reaching implications for gun rights, the authority of states to enact regulations, and the scope of the Second Amendment. At the heart of the matter is the balance between individual gun rights and public safety concerns. The Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right of citizens to keep and bear arms, but it is not an absolute right. Courts have consistently recognized that reasonable regulations can be imposed to ensure public safety and prevent the possession of firearms by dangerous individuals. The state of California, in its amicus brief, argues that the Supreme Court should take up this case to clarify the application of the Bruen decision. It emphasizes that the Second Amendment does not prevent states from enacting critical gun regulations, including those aimed at restricting firearm possession by individuals subject to domestic violence restraining orders. California asserts that the Fifth Circuit's conclusion that Section 922G8, which prohibits such possession, violates the Second Amendment on its face, was fundamentally mistaken. The Supreme Court's decision to grant or deny review in this case will shape the future of firearms regulation. If the court grants review, it will have the opportunity to provide clarity on the interpretation and application of Bruen, which reaffirmed the historical analysis of the Second Amendment. The court could potentially expand on the Bruen decision, providing more guidance on the constitutionality of specific regulations and the type of individuals who may fall outside the protections of the Second Amendment. On the other hand, if the Supreme Court denies review, the case will still have an impact as precedent. It may inspire challenges in other circuit courts, leading to further examination and potential reshaping of gun regulations across the country. The lower courts will grapple with interpreting and applying Bruen in the context of domestic violence restraining orders and other prohibited individuals, creating a patchwork of decisions and potentially generating further legal controversies. Ultimately, the future of firearms regulation and constitutional interpretation hinges on the Supreme Court's engagement with cases like this. The court's decision, whether it grants review or not, will shape the boundaries of gun rights, the permissible scope of state regulations, and the delicate balance between individual freedoms and public safety concerns. It is a complex and evolving area of law that will continue to be subject to scrutiny, legal challenges, and ongoing debates as society grapples with the appropriate approach to firearms regulation in the United States. Alternative defense methods. After the Supreme Court's landmark ruling affirming the constitutional right to carry handguns in public for self-defense, there has been increased interest in exploring alternative methods of personal defense. While the ruling primarily focuses on firearms, individuals and communities are now considering other means to protect themselves in light of the expanded interpretation of the Second Amendment. This exploration is driven by various factors, including concerns about the accessibility and safety of firearms, the desire for non-lethal options, and the potential impact on social dynamics and public safety. One area of focus in exploring alternative methods of personal defense is self-defense training and martial arts. Many people are seeking to acquire the skills and knowledge necessary to defend themselves without relying solely on firearms. Self-defense classes and martial arts disciplines provide individuals with techniques for physical protection, situational awareness, and conflict de-escalation. These training programs empower individuals to feel more confident in their ability to protect themselves and others regardless of their access to firearms. Another avenue being explored is the use of non-lethal self-defense tools and technologies. These include items such as pepper spray, stun guns, tasers, personal alarms, and other devices designed to incapacitate or deter attackers without causing permanent harm. Non-lethal options offer individuals an alternative means of defense that may be more socially acceptable, particularly in settings where the presence of firearms is heavily regulated or discouraged. Community-based initiatives focusing on safety and security are also gaining attention. Neighborhood watch programs, community patrols, and citizen-led initiatives promote collective vigilance and community engagement in deterring crime and enhancing personal safety. By fostering a sense of shared responsibility and cooperation, these programs aim to create safer environments without relying solely on individual armed self-defense. Technological advancements are also shaping the landscape of personal defense options. Innovations in personal safety devices such as wearable alarms, mobile apps for emergency assistance, and home security systems provide individuals with immediate access to help and enable rapid response in threatening situations. These technologies offer an additional layer of protection and can complement traditional self-defense methods. The post-ruling exploration of alternative methods of personal defense is driven by a desire to adapt to the evolving legal landscape, address concerns related to firearms, and promote a comprehensive approach to personal safety. By diversifying the available options and empowering individuals through training, technology, and community involvement, it is hoped that people can find effective and suitable means of self-defense that align with their values, needs, and local regulations. And that's all for this video, folks. We'll see you next time at the next one.